Limiting reactant, excess reactant, and percentage yields problems. Example 13. We have a balanced chemical equation, the same one we used for example 12, and we have the molar masses listed below. It says if 3645 grams of iron sulfate and 2245 grams of chromium borate, what is the theoretical yield of chromium sulfate? So theoretical yield means, it's a fancy way of saying, how much starting with the limiting reactant. How much should I get starting with the limiting reactant? Theoretical just means how much. Theoretical yield. In theory, with perfect chemistry, how much should I get? Theoretical yield again means how much should I get starting with the limiting reactant. In this case, it's asking how much of chromium sulfate would I get starting with the limiting reactant. Because we're not told what the excess reactant is, or we're not told what the limiting reactant, we must do two grids. So here's my two grids. Taking my 3645 grams of iron sulfate, that's this, and I'm going to chromium sulfate. Why chromium sulfate and not both? Because I specifically asked about the theoretical yield of chromium sulfate. So again, theoretical yield, how much would I get starting with the limiting reactant of what? In this case, chromium sulfate. So I took each of my starts, two starts are up here, and I went to chromium sulfate. I'm going to find the one that produces the least amount. So this, I circled this just because it's the least amount. Therefore, this means that iron sulfate is my limiting reactant. By default, then, chromium borate will be my excess reactant. So iron sulfate is my limiting reactant because it produced the least amount when I compared both of my starts to the same comparison point. I took these two to the same comparison point. Smallest amount tells me what my limiting reactant is. This cannot be a limiting reactant because it is not a reactant. A limiting reactant is a start. So this is my limiting reactant because it produced the least amount.